Welcome to This Week in Christian History, a podcast from the Center for Christian History at Mississippi College. The Center for Christian History is dedicated to expanding knowledge and understanding of Christian history. Our mission is to provide a scholarly, unbiased look at the events, figures, and movements that have shaped Christianity over the centuries. You can visit centerforchristianhistory.com for daily historical highlights. And each week on this podcast, we'll do a deep dive into key moments with Christian history's leading authorities. Our first historical highlight for the week and the subject of our deep dive is Annie Wittenmyer, the first president of the Women's Christian Temperance Union. Made up of a group of women who spoke out against the consumption of alcohol, the WCTU ultimately argued for the implementation of anti-alcohol legislation. At its peak, the WCTU claimed over 1,000 chapters across the U.S. and played a major role in the ratification of the 18th Amendment. Wittenmyer served as the WCTU's president from 1874 to 1879 and died on February 2, 1900. Our next historical highlight is theologian John Calvin's last sermon, which he preached on February 6, 1564. Calvin was so frail that in order to get to his church, he had to be carried while seated in a chair. It is believed that he had malaria and had overworked himself to the point of exhaustion and sickness. He would die 3 months later. Our final historical highlight for the week is the ratification of the Westminster Confession of Faith, one of the most important events in Protestant history. The British Parliament ratified the confession on February 7, 1649. It held that the Bible contained the holy, inerrant, and authoritative Word of God, and that anything else, including the Apocrypha, was not to be considered Scripture. Today in our deep dive, Nick Walters, founder and director of the Center for Christian History, talks with Jennifer Woodruff Tait about Annie Wittenmyer.
Hello and welcome to yet another episode of This Week in Christian History. We are extra excited to be able to have this episode rolling out because this is our 50th episode. So a whole lot of hard work by a whole lot of people on the team here at Mississippi College, particularly, and don't edit this out, Evelyn, but Evelyn Parsley is our student who has done a fantastic job of being our editor for all of our episodes of the podcast. And one of the reasons that the podcast has been successful is we found really great people as guests who are subject matter experts to help us discuss more things in Christian history. And one of the people who have helped us a great deal in finding those guests is our guest today. So how about all of that? So Dr. Jennifer Woodruff Tait with Christian History Magazine is our guest today. And our focus is to talk about Annie do you say Wittenmyer? How do you say it?
Wittenmyer.
Wittenmyer is how we're going to say it.
Wittenmyer.
Witten, yes. Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I left my T's out. Witten,
Yeah.
tried to do, who was the first president of the Women's Christian Temperance Movement. Some of you may recall that we did a Christian History Chronicles on the temperance movement that Dr. Woodruff Tait did for us. Her husband has been a podcast guest, and we love our relationship with Christian History Magazine. And eventually I'm going to be quiet, okay, and let her be able to talk. So thank you for joining us, and thank you again for all you've done to help us to make this podcast successful.
Well, I'm always glad to be here.
Well, it's always good info for us to have. So let's talk a little bit about Annie Wittenmyer and give us maybe a little background on what the WCTU was and why we would be talking about her at all, period, about the WCTU.
Yeah, well, she was the first president of the WCTU, which is Women's Christian Temperance Union. I have not women's, even though they had many women who were part of it. But I have had so many fights with proofreaders about this in my life, writing about temperance. So like each woman was having their own commitment to temperance, I guess,
Good.
is. So anyway, the Women's Christian Temperance Union, WCTU, she was the first president. She's much less famous than her successor, Frances Willard, who we're going to talk about in a minute. But she was born in 1827, and she's a Methodist. Not everyone, but a lot of people involved with the temperance movement were Methodists. It was, most Protestant churches, Lutherans were kind of an exception, but most Protestant churches were very committed to temperance, but Methodists, you'll generally find Methodists in the front of the pack in that. And she was a leader. Her name was Annie Turner Wittenmyer. We call her Annie Wittenmyer, but she actually divorced her husband fairly early in their relationship
Oh, really?
because he abandoned her. I assume that he went off with somebody else. That's usually what that term meant in the 19th century. So all of this she was doing. She was actually doing as a divorced woman. She had 4 children, but 3 of them died in infancy. She started out in reform during the Civil War. She did nursing in hospitals and also wrote about the conditions in hospitals. And so she was involved in, helping soldiers, helping orphans, and she worked for the Women's Home Missionary Society of the Methodist Episcopal Church. She was mainly known as a writer, so she began to write these books. She edited periodicals. She wrote hymns. I can't think of one off the top of my head, but I'm sure that you might be singing it. Look down. It was written by Annie Wittenmyer. And eventually she was among the people, many of whom were Methodist, who founded the Women's Christian Temperance Union. And the WCTU, which I'm going to keep saying so I don't have to remember to say women's.
Yes,
WCTU,
thank you.
grew in so it began in the 1870s, and it grew out of something called the Women's Crusade, which was something that took place mostly, as I recall, in Ohio, although I think it spread to some other places, where women would gather in front of saloons. They would pray. They would practice forms of nonviolent protest. Sometimes people would, throw water on them and yell at them and do all sorts of things to get them to go away. And they just kept silently witnessing and praying in front of saloons. And it became this huge movement. And there's a great book about it, if you ever want to read about it, called "Give to the Winds Thy Fears." Winds with a D. The guy who wrote it is called Jack Blocker. This is a book from like the 70s. He's been dead a long time, but when I first started researching temperance many years ago, it was a really foundational book. So anyway, so the Women's Crusade was amazing. And then there were people who said, okay, we need to channel this energy. If we want to work for the abolition of alcohol, which was, as I said a little earlier to you offline, a progressive social cause in the 19th century. It was,
Right.
we went to help women and help children, by getting rid of, drunken men who beat their wives and, abuse their children. And so they said, we need to organize women, because women, it was just assumed that all women would be in favor of temperance. And so we need to organize them. We need to get them to sign temperance pledges. We need to get them to get their husbands to sign temperance pledges, and out of that came the WCTU. And Annie was president of that for about 5 years. And under her, it was very specifically focused on temperance. But I know that Nick is going to ask me about her successor, Frances Willard, because under Frances Willard, it remained doing a lot of temperance work, but it began to also get involved in a lot of other social causes as well. So
well, and that's a great segue for us to be able to talk about her. Now, how did they literally, expand and create chapters and that kind of thing? You had to have an enormous amount of time to just writing letters all the time. And
yeah, you think about how quickly you can send an email now. And the telegraph had been, was invented sort of, during the 19th century. And so it was possible, expensive, but possible, to contact people over, to have a more quicker form of contact. But mostly, unless you had an emergency, you wrote people letters. And so all of this was, they published, periodicals and other literature. And so women would come upon WCTU literature. They would say, I want to form a chapter. They would write, to Annie and then to Frances, and, then they would write to the national folks, and the national folks would say, here's what you need to do to form a chapter. And then they would get together and they would have activities and, send in, which could be anything from like, praying at saloons to, doing things for kids, who were affected by alcohol abuse. I mean, of their parents' alcohol abuse and that kind of thing. And then they would send in reports, and they had these big national conventions every year.
Mm.
That they would all come and they would hear speeches from the president and from other people to sort of encourage them for the fight, and then more and more, that many of them also in these chapters began to work for legal remedies against prohibition, which is not really part of the Annie story. Annie was much more into what people call moral suasion. Trying to convince people that drinking was a bad idea, but not necessarily codifying it into law. But more and more, and not just the WCTU, but the whole country, as we move towards the establishment of prohibition in the early 20th century, the whole country became full of people and groups who were working for ways to forbid the manufacture and sale of alcohol. Starting in Maine in 1851, there was a thing called the Maine Law, which was a prohibition law in Maine. And so for the rest of the century, all the literature, it's like, wherever it was being written, no, we need a Maine law here. And it was out of and in many places, cities, states, towns, whatever, some laws would be established, and so national prohibition didn't come out of nowhere. It came out of the work of all of these people, including the
Sure.
WCTU. So
Sure. Well, that's a great way for us to segue and talk about Frances Willard. She's as we think about the 250th anniversary of the United States, and we start to think about places like Washington, D.C. in that frame of reference of all of that as well. Frances Willard is one of the two statues in Statuary Hall that were sent to Statuary Hall by the state of Illinois. The other one being Abraham Lincoln, right?
Yeah,
So she's in good company, right? But
it's hard to underestimate how important Frances Willard, to set the stage here, was Annie Wittenmyer's successor as president of the WCTU.
And did Frances Willard defeat Annie Wittenmyer for president? Was there a race for it, or did Annie just kind of, you think, understood, hey, this thing's starting to move a different direction than I really want to expand it to, and so she backed out, or she was tired? I'm sure she was tired after several years of
there was I'm not sure exactly the method they used to, but it was an elected position. So she was already she was part of the founders. She became the corresponding secretary, so everybody knew her because she was the person, when you run into the national office, Frances Willard would write you back. And also she also edited some publications, and so she essentially campaigned for this and was elected by the people who were there.
The delegates.
I'm not sure exactly how they chose delegates and exactly who could vote and that sort of thing, but it was an elected position that she came to. Yeah, and then she was elected in 1879. So Wittenmyer had been there 5 years, and then Willard died in the position. She died in 1898. So that's nearly 20 years then that she was president.
Wow. Yeah. And then but did Annie stay still active with the
Annie stayed active for a while, with a caveat. No, Annie stayed active and continued to try to because Frances Willard had this policy which she called "Do Everything," which, by the way, I want to make sure I stop and mention this. I just finished reading very recently new biography of Frances Willard, and the biography is called "Do Everything."
Okay.
Yeah, it's by Christopher Evans from Oxford University Press, and it's not actually, I thought it was the first academic biography of Willard when I was reading it, but it's the first in about 40 years. And it was a really good book. It took her faith seriously, but it also took her politics seriously. So anyway, some of what I know about her, I learned over the past 3 weeks. But anyway, but the book is called "Do Everything" because that was her motto for the WCTU. She wanted them to be involved in as many reform efforts as possible. In particular, she was very committed to women's suffrage. She was also, although she didn't really press the WCTU on this, I did not realize this until I read the book, she also experienced a call to the ordained ministry, which, because she was a woman, did not that's a whole other story about how she was very close friends with some of the other people who were working for women's ordination and women's representation as laity at General Conference and all those sorts of things in the Methodist Church. So the author of Do Everything seems fairly convinced that she, from her writings and stuff, that she herself felt that she was called into the ministry. But anyway, her idea was that the WCTU should do suffrage, should do other work to help fallen women, prostitutes, that sort of thing. So sort of any social cause you could think of that was happening, she wanted the WCTU, with always temperance at the center, but she wanted the WCTU to get involved in it. And Annie was still a member of the WCTU and was still liked and didn't really agree with this, and so was part of some fights that happened against Willard's leadership, particularly about, I don't remember the dates exactly, I can look it up, but there was, Willard wanted very much to get the WCTU on board as an official supporter of the U.S. Prohibition Party, which was a third party that formed in this era that was a single issue party. The issue was, we want national prohibition, we want state prohibition, we want local prohibition, we want legal prohibition everywhere. And a bunch of people, I just looked up the date, it's 1890, a bunch of people split off from the WCTU and formed what they called the nonpartisan WCTU. And Annie Wittenmyer, she wasn't the leader of that, but she was one of those people because the idea was this is an organization that will work only for temperance and will not get involved in politics and will not officially support political parties and platforms. So Annie died, I got to actually look at the dates, I'm terrible with remembering dates. So Annie died in 1900. So after that, but she remained involved and opposing Frances Willard until she died.
You can watch the rest of Nick's interview with Jennifer Woodruff Tait by clicking the View Full Interviews button on the podcast page of centerforchristianhistory.com. This Week in Christian History is produced for the Center for Christian History by Blue and Gold Media at Mississippi College in cooperation with the MC Department of Communication. For episode transcripts and more information, visit centerforchristianhistory.com. Be sure to subscribe on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube, and follow the Center for Christian History on Facebook and Instagram. Our next podcast episode is coming next week. Thank you for listening.